I first met Cesar Lobos de Madrid in our junior year of college. I went to one of those small, interchangeable liberal arts schools that dot the New England countryside. And it always seemed an unlikely place to meet someone like Cesar. Even though the college made a big deal of diversity, the student body was mostly upper-middle-class wasps like me. As far as I know, Cesar was the only person of Latino descent in my entire class. Of course, Cesar didn't look much like most Latinos because he was white, not mestizo. He could trace both sides of his family all the way back to 15th century Spain, and he looked every bit like his European forefathers. He looked like the Mexicans you see on Spanish-language TV. Watch it sometime and you'll know what I mean. More fair-skinned than a Swedish ski team. Also, Cesar didn't come from the average Mexican socioeconomic class. His family was one of the oldest, wealthiest, and most politically connected in Chiapas, if not in all of Mexico. They'd made their money in mahogany and coffee and land and cattle and oil and politics and, well, who knows what else. There's no doubt that if Cesar had wanted to go to any of the Ivy Leagues, he could have. He was smart and studious enough, or if he wasn't, his father could have built a dorm or library or hospital or something to get him admitted. But as it was, Cesar ended up in my little second-tier college for overprivileged white kids. His father, it turned out, had a great admiration for a particular economics professor who'd made a big stir in Reagan's first administration. Senor Lobos de Madrid wanted his son to study with this conservative economist, so he pulled some strings to postpone Cesar's enlistment in Mexico's compulsory military service and shipped him off to Vermont, where Cesar became the darling of a certain faction of the econ department. Of course, when Coach first introduced us, I didn't care about the Lobos de Madrid family's interest in supply-side economics. What I cared about was Cesar's talent as a striker. He was an absolute soccer phenom. In my freshman and sophomore years, we'd been playoff contenders thanks entirely to a defense anchored by Billy Jones in goal, Chris Thompson at sweeper, and me at left back. Our problem was scoring. We just didn't have any offensive weapons. If we fell behind, that was it. Hit the showers, boys, and we'll get them next time. But all that changed with Cesar's arrival. In his first season, he shattered the league's single-season scoring record. Senior year, it was like we were playing with 3 extra guys. We went undefeated and won the division championship by a score of 6-1. Cesar scored 4 goals and was unanimously voted the league's MVP. He was so good that after he went back to Mexico and completed his stint in the military, he played 3 seasons with Cruz Azul in Mexico's professional league. He got passed over for the 1990 World Cup, but just barely, and there was talk that he would probably be called up to the national team the next time around. He was that good. Then, in an improbable accident, he shattered his femur on a goalpost during a corner kick and was forced to end his career. More than one analyst described it as a sad day for Mexican soccer. But it wasn't just his soccer skill that I liked. I liked him. Almost everyone did. He had an unusual charm. Sure, it didn't hurt that he was a rich, good-looking star athlete with just enough Latin lilt in his voice to, in the words of a female classmate, make a lady want to cross her legs. But he had something more to his personality, something less tangible, something magnetic. Well, he could be in a crowd of 50 people, and he'd make each one feel like he or she was the most interesting person in the room. Well, he hadn't been on campus more than 48 hours when he showed up at a party and left with Leslie Branforth Covington, universally recognized as the most attractive and unapproachable woman on campus. The funny thing is that for all his popularity, very few people actually knew Cesar. Well, you could have a conversation with him, and because he would have listened and made you feel important, you'd think you'd made some profoundly intimate connection. But more likely than not, you would have learned next to nothing about him. Just about everyone who met him would refer to Cesar as a friend, even a close friend. but I bet only a handful of us knew anything about him, besides that he was a soccer star and came from someplace in Mexico that nobody had heard of. Part of it was Cesar's natural personality. Some people are simply born with more charisma than others, and he was one of those people. But his family cultivated that quality too. Cesar grew up with what I can only call old world values. Being a good listener and making other people feel comfortable was, for Cesar, a question of good manners, a matter of grace. And of course, it's easier to be polite, a polite listener, if people aren't always telling you about their problems and faults. In Cesar's world, people, particularly men, didn't talk about their private lives or personal problems. He was horrified by the whole touchy-feely American thing about expressing yourself and sharing your feelings. As far as he was concerned, that was what the confessional was for. And although Cesar was Catholic by culture, he wasn't someone to spend Sundays in church. Really, he was a caballero in the classic sense of the word. If something bad happened that he couldn't control, Cesar picked it up and carried it, chalking it up to mala fortuna. If something bad happened that he could control, he took his licks and then took action. What he didn't do was go sob his guts out to someone else, and he didn't appreciate men who did. One night in college, Johnny Gilbride got drunk and came crying about his girlfriend cheating on him. Cesar had been on campus only a month or so, but because Cesar was Cesar, Johnny went to him with his problem. Cesar listened and ultimately sent Johnny away, feeling better. But from that moment on, Cesar lost all respect for Johnny. For Cesar, a man simply didn't break down and blubber over an unfaithful girlfriend. To behave that way showed a certain flaw of character, a lack of moral toughness, and a degree of bad manners. He never said another word about it, but he also never looked at Johnny the same way again. I felt bad for Johnny because he never did catch on that Cesar wouldn't be caught alone with him. To tell the truth, though, the incident didn't make me like Cesar any less. If one of my American friends had thought the way he had, I'd have thought the guy was being a narrow-minded jackass. But because Cesar's reaction was cultural, it seemed somehow acceptable, even appropriate. Plus, it was pretty amusing to see the lengths to which he would go to avoid poor Johnny. I don't think Cesar ever did find a balance at school between being polite and avoiding people who wanted to tell him their woes. Of course, as I'd later learn, there came a point at which social etiquette mattered less. There came a point when such trivialities as manners mattered not at all. But I didn't know that then. So, just about everybody liked Cesar and liked him a lot, even if they didn't really know him. I don't hold that against anyone. We were best friends, and it turns out I didn't know him all that well either. Now, before someone says maybe I just thought we were best friends, and maybe he was duping me the way he did Johnny, save it. Cesar and I hit it off from the start. One reason we became such fast friends was I could speak Spanish. And growing up in the West, I'd studied Spanish in high school and found I had a natural knack for the language. Also, a high school job as a short order cook, where most of the other guys in the kitchen were Mexican and spoke limited English, gave me lots of chances to practice. Once in college, I breezed through the course sequence for the foreign language requirement, and then ended up taking an extra semester of advanced conversational Spanish as an independent study to make up units from a dropped humanities class. It was the easiest A I ever earned. My fluent Spanish might not sound like such a big deal given that Cesar's English was flawless, but it was. Cesar was proud to be Mexican, and he didn't appreciate that some of our classmates seemed to think of Mexico as little more than a spring break beach resort. He even became rankled when people asked him what he thought of America and Americans, like Mexico isn't in America. So the fact I could speak Spanish showed a certain respect for his identity, or at least an awareness, and as a result, I earned Cesar's trust as few others could. Our conversations in Spanish provided us with an intimacy, and they definitely improved my command of the language. The other instant connection we had was soccer, or more specifically, Mexican football. One of the ways my high school Spanish teacher had us practice the language was by reading newspapers and whatnot. So I'd taken to reading Mexican football magazines and had become a fan. I followed teams like Chivas de Guadalajara and America and Pumas de la UNAM. And Cesar and I spent countless hours talking about the merits of certain players and teams. Even then, Cesar knew he would go pro, and he was constantly revising an imaginary roster of guys with whom and against whom he'd like to play. That I actually knew the names of the players he was talking about served as something of a homesickness salve for him during those cold Vermont winters. It's not like we ever sat around talking about our friendship, but I knew it was important to him. For a while, I didn't understand how important. Because he was such a force of personality, I couldn't help but feel like I was sort of following him around, like I was getting all the advantages of his company. Well, there's no doubt things were more fun when he was around. And then one day, Cesar and I walked into the locker room after practice, and Billy Jones referred to us as Batman and Robin. "I'm nobody's Robin," Cesar said. His index finger jabbed into Billy's chest. Cesar was pissed. Of course, Billy hadn't meant that I was the Batman of our duo, but Cesar's response made me think differently about our friendship and myself. He wasn't anyone's sidekick, but it turned out he didn't think I was either. That was something of a revelation for me. It was a huge ego boost. And from that point on, Cesar could do no wrong. Now, don't misunderstand. Not every side of him was so easy to like. Cesar was a jumble of contradictions. He was a playboy with an insane work ethic, both on and off the field. He was an athlete, a serious intellectual, a gentleman and a womanizer, a traditionalist who loved all things modern, someone easy to like and almost impossible to know, a man enormously generous who could be ridiculously self-centered and self-righteous. Even back then, he had an incredible temper that would come out of nowhere. It was rare, but volcanic. He could be petty and cruel, but just when you decide to tell him he was being a prick, he'd turn on whatever that quality was that he had to turn on, and no matter how unreasonable he'd been, he'd make you feel like it was you who'd been at fault, and would forgive you for it. Like the time he asked to borrow my old Buick station wagon. I said yes. But then we had an argument. Wasn't any big deal, but I didn't expect him to take the car in light of our spat. He did, though, and he accidentally wrapped it around a tree, totaled it. I'd spent most of my high school weekends and 2 summers flipping burgers to buy that car, so you can imagine how I was more than a little furious. Technically, he hadn't stolen it, but in the heat of the moment, I kind of felt like he had, and I had visions of punching him in the nose. But a single look from Cesar at the hospital where he was getting his ribs taped, and the only thing I wanted to know was if he would be ready for our next game. Never mind that he'd wrecked my car. What difference could an old beat-up station wagon make? That's the kind of power he had. No matter how angry I might be with something he would do, I could never be angry with him. Well, besides, he matched what my insurance gave me for the car, and I bought a newer model Subaru with the proceeds. So, when Cesar asked if I wanted to room with him senior year, he didn't have to ask twice. We were the best players on the best team in the league. We were the big men on campus. He was Mr. Offense and I was Mr. Defense. We were Batman and Batman. Well, that's what I told myself. It all seems pretty childish now, but back then I thought our friendship made us both more cool and important. I suppose in some ways it did. Our friendship definitely made me feel like I was owed more attention and respect. He gave me the self-confidence to be myself. I thought I did the same for him. Of course, that kind of self-confidence isn't really any kind of self-confidence at all, but that's what I thought. Cesar was an undeniable force, like gravity, and I was drawn in. Cesar and I only saw each other once between graduation and the day I moved down to live with him in Chiapas 7 years later. We'd been great college friends, and we stayed in fairly close touch by phone. But when college ends, friends part, so we went on to live our lives. For Cesar, that meant compulsory service in the Mexican military, and then professional football, and a certain measure of fame. For me, it meant meeting Jen. I'd moved back to Denver, was living above my parents' garage, and had taken a job in the Human Resources Department of a subpoena and copy service. After the good times of college, I was stupefied by the boredom and monotony that can be adulthood. Like me, my two best friends from high school had moved away after graduation, but they had not returned since college, so I didn't have much of a social life. And my job was fantastically dull. And then the winter arrived. Having skied in Vermont the previous winters, I was excited to get back to Rocky Mountain powder. We'd had good early snow, so the first weekend the resorts opened, I loaded my skis on the roof rack of the Subaru and headed for Breckenridge. It was a perfect ski day. Fresh snow on a thick base, clear skies, no wind, and only moderate crowds. I'd completed a couple of runs and was standing in one of the singles lines, just waiting my turn and people watching, when I noticed the weather gal from one of the local TV news stations. I couldn't remember her name, but she was really attractive. And it was pretty clear that she had the attention of most of the men in the lines. It was also pretty clear that she knew it. I watched the order the chair operator was using to load the lift and match singles, and it was my lucky day, because in another 5 chairs, I was going to be paired with her. Then a man standing outside the ropes told the boy to get out of line. The boy complained, and when I saw that his exit meant the chair pairings would change, I almost spoke up on the kid's behalf. But I didn't. The weather beauty went up the mountain with some other guy, and I got matched with another single, Jen. I'll never forget the way she turned to me once we were on the lift. She moved her goggles from her eyes to her forehead, smiled that goofy, guffawing smile she had, and said, "I just took the biggest digger ever." After all this time, the image that has always remained most clear from that moment is the moving of her goggles, her white gloves grasping the white frame with magenta lens and pulling it from her face and setting it over her purple ski cap. It's not her eyes or the way she looked at me. It's just the way she moved the goggles, well, that and the smile. Even now, when I think of our first meeting, this is what I see. We fell into conversation about the snow conditions and skiing and which slopes we liked best. At some point, it came out that her family had a house in Breckenridge, and they were up for a long weekend. But she was the only one who had decided to ski that day. I don't know what else our conversation was about or who suggested it, but by the time we'd reached the top of the mountain, we'd agreed to go down a particular Black Diamond run together. It turned out we were pretty good skiing partners. She was a much better technical skier than I was because she'd been skiing since she could walk, and I'd only picked it up my junior year of high school when my family moved to Denver. But soccer had made my legs strong, and I liked going fast and tended to bully my way down the mountains. We ended up pounding the slopes all day together. On the lifts, we talked about all kinds of stuff, the conversation natural and easy. I told her about soccer and Vermont and my stupid job and not being sure what I wanted to do in the long term. She told me about the sorority she'd been in at UC Boulder and growing up in Denver. We'd gone to rival high schools. And her horses and working in her dad's company and taking night classes to get her MBA. Somehow it came out that we both spoke Spanish, and we conversed some until she decided my fluency made her self-conscious about her grammar. We talked about food, and she told me she had a soft spot for ice cream, a fact that I later learned was a gross understatement. Ice cream was an obsession. Well, she'd cross state lines if it meant trying a new ice cream place. We talked about music and all the bands we'd seen at Red Rocks Amphitheater. We'd been to a lot of the same shows, and we'd both gone to the Bob Dylan and Tom Petty concert that past July. We even figured that we had seats practically right next to each other. We laughed a lot too. Jen was blonde, and she liked to tell stupid blonde jokes. She had a seemingly endless repertoire. Why'd the blonde climb the chain link fence? To see what's on the other side. How do you make a blonde laugh on Saturday? Tell her a joke on Wednesday. How do you get a one-armed blonde out of a tree? Wave. Those are terrible, I said, laughing. I know, right? Why do blondes always smile during lightning storms? Why? They think their picture's being taken. We had such a good time that we skied until the lifts closed and the afternoon sunlight cast long shadows of the ridgeline across the mountain. The following July, we were married. In the lead up to the wedding, I asked Cesar to be my best man. But he just signed his contract with Cruz Azul, and it turned out that the first game of the season was scheduled the same day as the wedding. He half-heartedly offered to ditch the game, despite the contract's strict rules about what constituted a personal matter. But I told him it wasn't worth it. In the end, he would have come to the same conclusion on his own. There was no way he was going to miss the first game of his professional career. We were sorry he couldn't attend the wedding until Cesar scored the winning goal and dedicated it to us in English during the post-game interview. That goal was for Hank and his new bride, Jen, he said. Congratulations, guys. Jen thought that was quite the wedding present. She must have shown the video to 50 people. Even though they hadn't met at that point, they'd spoken several times on the phone, and Jen had been taken in by his charm as much as anyone. Also, Jen could be easily starstruck, which was funny because it wasn't a quality you'd expect in her. I think she was impressed that my friend was on TV all the time, like his relative fame somehow rubbed off on us. As cool as the dedication was, it was the day I finally did see Cesar again that cemented our connection forever. It was the day of Susan's baptism. The week Susie was due, Cesar was playing in an exhibition tournament in Brazil. Even so, he called every day to see if the baby had arrived. We'd just come home from the hospital after Susie was born when the phone rang. It was Cesar. So, 7 pounds, 6 ounces. Felicidades, he cheered through the phone. Oh, I could picture him jumping up and down. ¿Cómo se llama? Susan Ann Singer. Que lindo. How is she? Beautiful. And Jen? Fine, tired, but fine. Oh, better than fine. That's good. I'm glad. Cesar, I said, we're going to baptize her at the Episcopal Church. It's where Jen's folks go. Uh-huh. Jen and I have talked about it a lot, and, well, she wants me to ask you if you'll be Susan's godfather. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Are you there, I asked. I thought maybe he'd been cut off. You tell Jen it would be my very great honor. His voice was as solemn as I'd ever heard it. Do you know what this means? What? It means we're going to be compadres. No. In Mexico, you'll hear men call each other compadre a lot. Even before I asked Cesar to become godfather to my daughter, we called each other compadre, just like we might call each other buddy or pal. The word is used loosely between friends all the time. In Mexico, you can even hear virtual strangers call one another compadre. As a colloquial form of address, the word can be applied in all sorts of situations, but in its formal or traditional use, men can only earn the title when one man becomes godfather to the other's child by taking an oath as part of the religious ceremony during a baptism or first communion. It's a sacred trust. Once a man's your compadre, no matter what happens, he's always your compadre, your family, brothers for life. The bond can't be broken. While I knew what the word meant, I didn't fully comprehend its significance. You're not going to cry, are you? I asked. I mean it. Don't make jokes. Es algo sagrado. You've asked me to be your daughter's second father, to watch out for her in case you die. Well, let's hope that's not necessary. No, compadre. Do you understand? I do, I said, and suddenly I did. I had at least one friend in the world who would look out for my little girl no matter what. When is it? Well, we haven't decided. I'll let you know. I'll be there. It doesn't matter when, I'll be there. True to his word, he flew in for the baptism on the family jet and flew out the same day to get back for a game. Even though he was in town for less than 5 hours, it was 5 hours that changed us. From that time on, it wasn't a question of if we'd see each other again, it was a question of when. But before Jen and Susie died, never in a million years would I have pictured myself living in Cesar's house in southern Mexico. Never. Of course, before the accident, I thought my whole life was going to turn out different than it has. As soon as he heard, Cesar started calling almost every day. I rarely had anything to say, so after some long periods of silence, when Cesar would be waiting for me to talk, he'd then tell me about his physical therapy or his getting involved in the family business or whatever. Didn't matter what he talked about. It was just his way of letting me know I wasn't alone. I knew he was hurt and more than a little angry that I hadn't called him after the accident. I hadn't even told him about the funeral. He hadn't seen Susie after the baptism, but he'd sent her presents for Christmas and her birthdays and the anniversary of her baptism, and he developed a phone friendship with Jen. So I knew he was upset with me. He had a right to be. But the truth was I hadn't called anyone, and he never again brought up this lapse of courtesy once he knew that. He just called to remind me that he had my back. Even now, as angry as I can get about what happened later, I have to admit those phone calls meant as much to me as anything anyone has ever done. They were one of the few things that kept me sane that whole year. It was about 6 months after the funeral that he started suggesting I come down. The phone would ring and I'd answer, "Hey, compadre, ¿qué estás haciendo?" he'd ask. Sitting. And doing what? Drinking scotch. Watching tapes of Susie at swim class. Puta madre, compadre. What are you doing to yourself? Turn that shit off and get out of there. Come down here. We'll drink scotch together. I've got a job. Como? You still think you're going to take over the company from Jen's dad? What's the matter with you? Get down here. Cesar had a point. I'd gone to work for Jen's dad. He'd offered me the job the day we got back from our honeymoon. He had a big construction company, Talbert Construction, and with Jen being his only child, the plan had been for us to take it over when he retired. A week after the funeral, Jen's folks had me over for dinner, and her dad told me that what had happened wasn't my fault. Where else the blame could possibly lie, he didn't say. He said that it wasn't my fault and that he'd always think of me like a son and that the company was still mine if I wanted it. And he meant it too. At least I think he wanted to mean it. But he must have known I wouldn't stick. Call it age or wisdom or whatever. He knew in a way I didn't yet. Take it from me. When you're 28 and you watch your wife and 3-year-old daughter drown in a river because you were foolish and arrogant enough to take them down a rapid in a canoe that had no business being there, well, you have a tendency to feel like you watched your whole life end with them. You have a tendency to wish it had. Like it or not, it didn't. Not by a long shot. So while it took me more than a year to try to start my life over, I think Jen's dad saw it coming before dessert was on the table that night at dinner. He knew I had my whole life ahead of me, and once I got past the accident, I'd have to make that life one way or another. Jen's mom took it hard, though, particularly when I sold the house and most of our stuff. The sale of the house brought the final realization that the girls were not coming back. I had to sell it, though. There were too many ghosts. After the house was sold, I made the mistake of moving back into the room above my parents' garage. I'd simply known I had to get out of the house, and I hadn't thought too much about what came next. But living above the garage was worse. It was like I'd slipped back rather than moved forward. And to compound my misery, I found myself trying to avoid my parents and all their efforts to be comforting and sympathetic. I'd get home from the office and park my car in front of the neighbor's house and try to slip into my room without being seen. I'd leave the lights off and just sit with my thoughts. In my mind, I saw myself forever slipping into a hole of black water, my fingers digging desperately into the blackness to stop the perpetual slide. It was like I was watching myself watch myself sink into oblivion. It wasn't like drowning. Drowning ends in death. This was like drowning without dying. The whiskey may or may not have made it worse. This went on for almost 3 months, and then one morning, sitting in my car in the parking lot before work, I noticed an airplane trail in the sky. Then I noticed the sky. It was astonishingly blue. And I think that was the first time I'd really seen the color of the sky, or the color of anything, since the girls' deaths. Then I realized I was sitting beside myself, and watching myself began to recognize the world. I didn't feel any more inside or outside myself than I had before I saw that blue sky, but I was suddenly conscious of that separation, like I finally recognized what I had been experiencing for months. And in that moment, I felt an absolute necessity to get as far away from Colorado as I could. I went into the office and called a travel agent. I watched myself push the buttons on the phone and listened to myself buy a plane ticket to Chiapas for the following Monday. I watched myself phone Cesar and leave a message with my itinerary on his machine. Then I watched myself walk into my father-in-law's office and tell him I was leaving. He made a half-hearted effort to convince me to stay, but like I said, he'd seen it coming. So he gave me a hug and told me he understood. That was it. I walked out of the office, drove home to that damned room above the garage, and packed. That night, I watched myself tell my parents I was leaving. My mom cried the whole time, but my dad thought it was a good idea to get away and get a fresh perspective. I watched myself listen to him say the words, fresh perspective. I went to see Jen's mom the next day, and there were more tears. 3 days after that, I got on the plane. I hadn't even heard back from Cesar, and it didn't matter. I was going. In a lot of respects, I was already gone.